She searched the nebula, he searched the galaxy, and missed the one at home. Out past the beadwork of settled worlds, where starfrost clung to hull plates and suns rose like bruises in thin blue gas, humanity fenced a living out of the void. We learned to herd what the old-timers called lightstock, luminescent grazers bred to sip ion winds from auroral streams, and to tether them to magnetopastures stitched across newborn moons. We crossed gravity rifts in ships held together by faith and torque wrenches. We made homes where maps gave up and compasses panicked. Commander Clayton Rudd knew those edges. He had ridden patrol skiffs into pirate shadows, bartered oxygen with miners who spoke in sparks, and turned back from storms that would sandblast a man's memories. He had the contracts, the acreage, the reputation. He did not have a partner, and out here, investors trusted a household more than a hero. 5 formal courtships had failed, most with laughter polite enough to sting. You need refinement, towners told him. You need a name, the syndicate said. Somewhere between those verdicts, Clayton hardened. Or thought he did. Because what he was looking for among the stars had been inside his own star fortress all along. Ella Torren kept Frontier 9 breathing, balancing heat like a hymn, coaxing cantankerous pumps to purr, reading the rhythm of a place the way others read a lover's face. A widow with hands steady as sunrise, she moved through the fortress and left it kinder. When a rival captain set his sights on both the biggest lightstock contract in the quadrant and the woman who kept Clayton's world from coming apart at the seams, the Frontier found its fault line. And the question wasn't how far a man would travel to win, but what he would finally admit to keep from losing. Tell me, traveler, if the heart is a star, how many jumps will you make before you realize home was the light already in your sky? Chapter 1, Frontier 9 Wakes to the Aurora. The first lesson a frontier man learns is that maps lie. The second is that machines tell the truth, but only to those who listen long enough. Clayton Rudd stood alone in the observation gallery of Frontier 9 while the nebula breathed color against the glass. The auroral streamers swept in slow ribbons, pale green over cobalt, a light show born from charged particles and stubborn human will. Far below, his magnetopastures glowed in dotted arcs, each pasture a patient circle holding 100 head of lightstock to their tethers. They grazed in silence, luminous ruminants drifting nose-deep in an invisible wind of ions. 800 in total this cycle. Enough to make a modest living. Not enough to buy time. He wrapped chilled fingers around a steaming cup and sipped. Strong, smooth, Ella's brew, calibrated to cut the fog from any bad morning. Clayton smiled despite himself. An engine's rhythm steadied in the floor, pumped 3 back to true after a week of sulking. Someone had coaxed it right. He didn't need a report to know who. Bootsteps approached, purposeful, unhurried. Ella Torren stepped into the gallery, hair tied in a practical knot, a grease smudge just under one eye like a small constellation she'd forgotten to wipe away. She took the empty cup from his other hand without being asked and traded it for a full one that had appeared, as if by sorcery, at precisely the moment his first cup ended. Pump 3's singing again, Clayton said. It was out of tune, Ella replied, listening with her fingertips against the rail. The inlet valve wanted attention and a little kindness. A little kindness. He tried the phrase on his tongue. In a place where everything was steel and vacuum and numbers, she had a way of naming the invisible. The fortress approved of Ella. So did he. So did every system that liked to live. Audit packet from the syndicate pinged at 0400, she added, eyes out on the pastures. Their ships made the turn at Cedar Ridge Station. Early. Clayton felt his jaw tighten. They said next quarter. They say a lot of things. The courier's log is a better oracle. Investors. He made the word a half-joke, a half-prayer. They want reliability. They want a story they can eat with a spoon, Ella said, gentler than her words. But you have one. A good one. The fortress hummed around them. Below, floodlights tracked a skiff as it arrowed toward Pasture 2. Vernon Pike, young and all elbows, was learning to cut with the wind instead of against it. He'd do. Otis, old as rust and twice as useful, would make sure of it. A chime threaded the gallery air. External contact. Docking ring 3. Clayton set the cup down and straightened his jacket. Out here, you learn to read a ship by the sound of its arrival. This one came in proud and careful, the way money moves when it wants to be admired. Ella's eyebrow rose. Visitors? Or a parade, he said. Either way, we'd better look like we meant to be awake. They took the lift down, rode the slow thrum past maintenance decks and storage nests. Dock 3 blossomed open on their approach. The hull beyond bore the livery of Helena Interstellar, golden script looping over gunmetal. He didn't need the registry ping to guess the rest. Sarah Montgomery stepped through the air curtain like a dress rehearsed to perfection. Her coat was cut for gravity and compliments, her smile precise enough to measure. "Commander Rudd," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Our mutual friend Mrs. Drummond insisted I visit before the season turned." Clayton took the hand, surprised at the strength behind the lace. "Helena's a long ride to come admire a cow," he said. "I came to admire an operation," Sarah corrected, eyes sliding, assessing. They landed briefly on Ella, who had become, by instinct, smaller, quieter, and somehow more essential in the same breath. "And perhaps to help an investor or two see what you've built." They walked. Clayton narrated, pastures, tethers, calibrations, the way you teach lightstock to graze in a stream without slipping the magneto hooks, the way storms could knock a man flat if he trusted yesterday's forecasts. Sarah listened with the patience of a ledger. She asked about yield curves, failure modes, redundancy. She smiled at the right places and did not pretend to understand when she didn't. It was disarming, and a little like being examined by a very expensive instrument. In the control core, Ella handed Sarah a pair of gloves without comment. "Glass scratches easy," she said. Sarah took them, and for a heartbeat their eyes met, two different schools of competence measuring each other. Sarah's smile warmed a degree. "Thank you, Mrs. Torren," Ella said. "Systems." "Of course," Sarah said, as if adding a crucial note to a file. The tour ended where tours should, at the edge of a window big enough to forgive a man his worst days. The nebula obliged them with a curtain of violet no one had ordered. Sarah's reflection stood beside Clayton's, elegant and correct. Behind them, Ella adjusted a panel as if tuning a piano that had drifted sharp with the cold. "What you've built here is singular," Sarah said softly, the kind of softness that precedes negotiation. "And fragile. The syndicate wants to believe in story and in stewardship. Investors, Commander, like what they can count. But they love what they can visit." "Visit," Clayton repeated. "You mean dinner." "I mean culture." Sarah's eyes traced the gallery. "A household. A hearth. A place that says, we intend to be here tomorrow." He felt the old argument rising, the one that tasted of dust and pride. "My pastures say that. My deliveries. They say you're competent," Sarah said, without malice. "A household says you're rooted." Ella's hand stilled on the panel. For a moment, all three listened to the fortress breathe. A voice broke the spell, cheerful, a shade too loud. "Clay." Tad Crowley's face appeared in the hatchway, grin already 3 moves ahead. He swept off a hat nobody needed in controlled weather and let charm fill the room like warm air. "Heard I'd find you showing off. Ms. Montgomery, I presume?" "Tad Crowley, at your service. I brought decent coffee from the station, figured you'd want to taste something city while you talked city." He shook Sarah's hand with the flourish of a man who liked an audience. He nodded at Ella as if to an equal or a rival, with Tad it could be hard to tell. "Tad," Clayton said. "Didn't hear your knock." "I knocked with beauty," Tad said, gesturing to the nebula beyond the glass. "And with a docking permit I forgot to file." Sarah laughed, genuine, this time. Ella didn't. Clayton felt the gallery shift underfoot, not a quake, something subtler, like gravity remembering its prerogatives. They took coffee, Tad's, infuriatingly good, and Clayton let the rival talk an inch too long. Tad was a born host, his sentences came pre-seasoned. He spoke of syndicate tastes, of legacy narratives, of a banquet he'd once thrown on a comet that hadn't stopped moving the whole meal. He made the frontier sound like a club. Sarah listened. Ella tidied a non-existent crumb from a console, then slipped away the way night slips from a window when morning insists. When she was gone, the room felt colder. Clayton found himself watching the hatchway as if expecting her to return with some small merciful task. She didn't. Tad noticed. Of course he did. Frontier 9 runs tight, Tad said, casual as gossip. Tight's good. For numbers. For hearts, sometimes it's a pinch. Sarah drank the last of her cup and set it down with an elegant click. I'd like to see the pastures up close, she said. At dusk. Dusk is when they glow, Tad supplied, too helpful by half. We'll take the skiff, Clayton said, more firmly than the sentence required. Sarah's eyes moved between them, the way a navigator reads 2 stars to plot a third. Perfect, she said. I do enjoy a good view. They set a time. Sarah returned to her ship with the promise of later. Tad lingered in the gallery, tilting his grin toward the aurora like a man tipping his hat to a clever joke. She's quality, he said when they were alone. Takes a shine to operations that know their own name. Clayton answered the window. And you brought coffee. I brought timing, Tad said. You'll thank me when the syndicate eats at your table and calls it heritage. They can eat standing up, Clayton said, too quickly. Tad's grin softened, almost kind. They could, he said. But they won't. The external chime sounded again, another arrival, softer, humbler. Ella, back in the doorway, eyes flicking across the men, the cups, the nebula. Her face was unreadable, the way a locked hatch is neither hostile nor kind. Clayton opened his mouth to say something ordinary and safe. The fortress spoke first. A priority ping lanced the air. Otis on comms, voice like gravel under pressure. Boss, I've got a tremor in the upper stream and a weird bite in the pasture 3 tether. Not an alarm yet, but it wants to be. Clayton's coffee went forgotten on the rail. He met Ella's eyes and saw what he needed there, calm, multiplicative, ready. Skiff Bay, he said. Ella was already moving. Tad's grin didn't falter, but it changed, like a card turned over. Edge work, he said. My favorite kind. Then try to keep up, Clayton told him. They ran for the lift while the aurora outside deepened to a dangerous blue. Chapter 2, The Engineer Who Listens. The skiff's belly thrummed as it slipped from Frontier 9's underhang and cut a bright knife through the thin blue of the nebula. Pasture 3 hung ahead in a soft corona, an enormous hoop of anchored coils and pulsing nodes that made a pasture out of math and stubbornness. Inside it, 100 head of lightstock drifted in a loose, glimmering school, their translucent bodies tasting the ion wind the way cattle once nosed through grass. Telemetry, Clayton said, settling into the pilot's cradle. Spiking harmonics at coil sectors C5 through C7, Ella answered, already strapped into the engineer's chair with the console blossoming data under her touch. Otis, talk to me. The old hand's voice rattled through the skiff like gravel in a tin. Got a bite in the tether channel, boss. Like something's chewing on the carrier wave. I'm stationed side at the crowfoot anchor, wrench in one hand and a prayer book in the other. Any debris impacts? Ella asked. Nothing big. Might be micropitting. Might be that new ion shear the station weather which swore we wouldn't get till next week. Clayton boosted them into a shallow arc to keep the skiff between the herd and the open seam where the pastures field was thinnest. Behind him, a second harness buckled. He glanced back as Sarah Montgomery finished fastening the last clip with precise fingers. You don't have to be here, he said. Exactly why I should, Sarah replied, voice calm. Investors don't fear risk. They fear surprises. If I'm going to speak your language, I need to hear it in a storm. Ella slid Sarah a spare headset. Stay seated. If we roll, tuck forward. This isn't a show. Understood, Sarah said, and for once her tone had nothing to sell in it. The skiff's nose cone kissed the pasture field and set it ringing in a tone Clayton felt in his teeth. Field lures, he said. Ella's hands were already moving. The skiff's undercarriage lit with a comb of magneto beacons that painted the void in steady pulses. The lightstock twitched and turned as one, schooling toward the skiff's bait like birds catching a wind. We'll keep them from the thin patch, Clayton said, while Otis and I. You're not hopping out there, Ella cut in, without looking up. Not until I know what the bite is. Vernon, ping. The kid's voice arrived high and eager. On the coil spine at Sector C6, Ms. Torren. I'm seeing a shimmer on the line like heat over a road. Could be phase slip. Could be nothing, Otis muttered. Could be the universe clearing its throat. Hold, Ella said. She closed her eyes, not because she needed to, Clayton knew, but because it let her line the world up the way she liked it, sound, pattern, the memory of how a healthy system sang. Then she opened them and spoke in a new meter, slow and clean. Bring the skiff 2 degrees sunward, Clayton. Give me a hair more lure on the berail. Vernon, walk the crowfoot with your scope, slow, no heroics. Otis, kill chatter and put your palm on the anchor face. Tell me what you feel. What I feel. You've got a better sensor in that hand than any box we own. A chuckle like a rusted hinge came through. Feels like a horse about to spook, Otis said at last. Not moving yet, but it wants a reason. Copy. Ella's fingers danced. The anomaly on the screen sharpened, a crawl of noise that moved not in circles, but in a cheap imitation of one. She frowned. There, she said. Hear that? Clayton didn't, not until she tuned the gain and fed the channel through a filter that made the bite resolve into something almost like a voice. It wasn't damage, it was interference. Worse, it was regular. Someone else's pasture harmonics? Clayton asked. Or something trying to be them, Ella said. Sarah leaned forward just enough to be heard. A competitor spoofing your tether? Wouldn't that take proximity? Clayton felt heat rise under his collar. Tad, he said, and then didn't say the rest. Tad was many things. A saboteur shouldn't be one of them. Ella shook her head. It's cruder than Tad would allow within 5 kilometers of his name. More like Weather found a flute and is learning to play a tune it shouldn't. She glanced at the aurora, which had thickened from veil to tapestry. Ion sheer dancing across our carrier. Solution? Clayton said. Teach the pasture a new song. Ella's hands moved again. Drop the tether frequency by 3% and push a counter pattern in on the back channel. Not enough to lose the herd. Just enough to make the shear board. She did it, soft as a hand on a skittish animal. The bite wavered, tried another angle, then lost interest. The graphs settled. The lightstock relaxed, trails softening to lazy curls, and the pasture's hum slipped back toward comfort. Otis exhaled into the calm like a man who'd been holding his breath since breakfast. Whatever you did, do it again and then teach it to the new kid. I will, Ella said. Vernon, eyeballs on the crowfoot. Anchor looks tired, Vernon said. Surface micropits just like you guessed. Nothing catastrophic. But C6 has a hairline. I'd like a brace. You'll get 2, Ella replied. Otis, write up the brace list and meet me at the shop. Clayton, keep the herd off the thin seam for an hour. I need to baby that tether until we can give it bones. Copy. Clayton eased the skiff into a lazy shepherd's arc and let his shoulders come down. He looked back. Sarah hadn't moved. Her knuckles were white around the armrests, but her eyes were bright. Respect, he realized, mixed with something hungrier, understanding. "That filter you built," she said to Ella. "Is that standard?" "No," Ella said. "It should be." Sarah nodded as if filing a patent number in her head, and then shook her head, more human. "Investors should see this," she said softly. "Not the graphs. The steadiness." "They'll see the delivery schedule," Clayton said. "They'll see the delivery schedule and infer the steadiness," Sarah replied. "But some people need to be shown where steadiness comes from." They finished the arc, coaxed the herd away from trouble, and slid the skiff home. In the docking bay, Tad was waiting because Tad was always waiting where the applause might be. He clapped once, slow, infuriatingly sincere. "Pretty," he said. "Didn't spill a drop." Ella brushed past him without pausing. "We've got a brace to weld." Tad touched his forehead in a mock salute. "Miss Torren," he said, tone almost respectful under the tease. "You ever get tired of making miracles in a fortress where nobody sees them, you come talk to me. I'll put a spotlight on that him of yours." Clayton turned, the snap already climbing his spine, but Sarah laid a hand on his sleeve and pinched just enough to be felt. He swallowed the answer he wanted to give and found another. "You bring a spotlight," he told Tad, "you blind the people doing the work. Or you let the right people see what they're paying for," Tad said lightly. "Sarah? Dusk tour still on? I've got a comet story I'm burning to tell." Sarah smiled. "I'll hold you to it." Clayton walked her back to her ship with Ella a half-pace behind, saying nothing, which was louder than most words. At the air curtain, Sarah paused. "Dinner," she said, and the word wasn't a question. "Investors always end up at someone's table. If it isn't yours, it will be Tad's." "I don't host," Clayton said. "You do," Sarah said, "every day. You just think dinners are decorations. They're data. People taste a household and decide whether they can live with the aftertaste of trusting you." She nodded toward Ella. "What I saw out there. That's what you serve." The air curtain whispered around her as she stepped through. Clayton watched the door seal and felt the shape of a truth he'd been avoiding press cold against his ribs. Ella didn't speak until the lift doors closed around them. "Brace first," she said. "Then you can go swat words with Tad." "Brace first," he agreed. They worked. In the small hours, with the nebula beating against the glass and the fortress humming its low lullaby, they welded a new rib into the crowfoot and felt the anchor's relief through the metal. The herd slept, or did whatever it was lightstock did when their bioluminescent minds went dim and content. Otis told stories while he held the brace, and Vernon fetched tools with the earnest competence of a boy who hasn't yet learned how to pretend. When it was done, they stood at the viewport and watched the coils glow even out. Ella leaned one shoulder against the frame and closed her eyes like a woman finally listening to her favorite song land on the right chord. Clayton looked at her profile and understood, in a flash that made his throat ache, that there were rooms in this fortress that only she could make livable. The comm pinged. A message icon blinked, syndicate seal high and polite. Clayton opened it. The text was bare of pleasantries, audit advance confirmed. Delegation will arrive in 72 hours. Initial dinner engagement scheduled with Crowley Holdings, Frontier-adjacent Comet facility. Secondary site visit, Frontier, 9. Another ping. A second message stacked beneath the first, this one routed unusually, not to Commander Rudd, but to Systems, Ella Torren. Ella swallowed when she saw the addressee. She didn't move to open it. "Go on," Clayton said, hating how careful his voice sounded. She tapped. The message unfolded, short, silken, unmistakable. "Ms. Torren. Your work today was noticed. If you'd ever like to discuss a role with more latitude, and compensation to match, my table is open. Dinner, tomorrow." Tad Crowley. The nebula threw a blue sheet of light over their faces. Ella didn't look at him. Clayton didn't trust his mouth. The fortress hummed on, neutral as a judge, while the message blinked like a tiny, patient star. Chapter 3, Hospitality is a Weapon. The comet facility dangling in Crowley space lanes could have been mistaken for a folly if it weren't so shrewd. Tad had lashed prefab modules to a traveling ice boulder, cut a gravity ribbon down the middle, and planted a dining hall with a window the size of a barn door against the universe. The comet's long, slow tumble kept the stars in motion, as if the sky had come to entertain. The trick, Tad said as he escorted them through the airlock, is to make folks feel like they're moving even when they're being sold. Some would say that is the definition of being sold, Sarah replied, amused. My favorite customers are the ones who know and buy anyway, Tad said. Makes the aftertaste honest. Clayton had almost turned the invitation down. Almost. But the syndicate had chosen Tad's table first, and a man didn't stay stubborn when the ledger looked him in the eye. He'd brought Ella and Otis because they were the closest thing he had to a household. Vernon had been left with the herd and a set of stern instructions he'd grinned right through. The hall was full enough to feel important without crowding. Chicago suits with boots too clean tried on frontier phrases. Local captains let them. Aroma coils simmered stew that smelled convincingly of soil the guests had never seen and bread that lied cheerfully about ovens. Music hummed under conversation, a traditional line made space-worthy by the synth that laid a heartbeat beneath it. Tad worked the room like a maestro. He drew lines between the syndicate's appetite and the frontier's offer. He set stories down like stepping stones and invited the visitors to walk across. He lifted a glass, told the comet story Sarah had been promised, made them laugh, made them belong. Good host, Sarah murmured to Clayton, apart. Best peacock in the nebula, Clayton said. The peacock attracts the eyes that pay, she countered. Consider learning a feather or two. Ella drifted in and out of the edge of things, head bent with Otis over a discussion of brace tolerances 1 minute, then guiding a logistics coordinator through the difference between redundancy and ritual the next. She didn't sell herself, she made competence look inevitable. When a junior auditor dropped a fork and sent it spinning end over end in a half-G, Ella plucked it from its tumble without looking and passed it back with a smile that made the kid stand up straighter. Tad saw that, of course. He conjured a microphone and tapped the rim of a glass so cleverly no one minded. Friends, he said, I promised you proof that the frontier isn't just grit with better scenery. It's skill. It's the kind of mind that hears a machine hum wrong from 3 decks away and hums back at the right pitch until the world remembers itself. He gestured, and before Clayton could intercept, Ella was standing where light made a stage out of a floor. He watched her spine lengthen, watched her tuck nerves into the same pocket she kept spare fuses. I don't sing, she said, to a ripple of polite laughter. But he's right about the hum. Systems speak. You can call it math. I do, when I have to write it down for the console. Mostly, it's listening. You learn what healthy is. You learn not to wait for the alarm. You fix what's about to go wrong before it makes a headline. Prevention isn't sexy, someone from the syndicate said. I'm not trying to be, Ella said, and something in the room leaned closer. Prevention is the kind of quiet that keeps your children asleep. It's the difference between a good quarter and a funeral. Clayton felt it then as if he were an investor himself, the way trust arrives not as a number but as a hand you'd let hold your life for 5 minutes while you ran to the next fire. He also felt a hot coil of something uglier when he saw Tad's face lit with pride he had no right to. When Ella finished, to real applause, not the polite kind, Tad stepped beside her, too near. Ms. Torren is proof that a household is not curtains, he said. It's the people who can make a place stand up in a wind. Crowley Holdings recognizes that. We pay for it. The words wore a smile, but the teeth were there. Clayton set his glass down hard enough to make a note in the table, and Sarah's hand found his sleeve again, the pinching now a warning he ignored. Generous speech, Clayton said, moving to join them. Almost convinces a man you're recruiting for the good of the frontier. I'm recruiting for the good of anyone who likes sleeping through the night, Tad said. He turned to Ella, lowered his voice enough to move the conversation into the intimacy of a corner even in the middle of a crowd. Dinner, Miss Torren? We're at dinner, Ella said. Tighter circle, Tad returned, undeterred. Tomorrow. Your call. Ella's eyes flicked, not to Clayton, but through him, to a point beyond his shoulder where the comet's window framed a spill of stars. She was thinking the thought he didn't want her to have to think: if I stay where I am, do I stay seen? If I go, am I just moving the shop? He had answers to both questions. He had none he could say here without cheapening them. Sarah slid into the gap he left with a conversational elbow and pulled Tad off toward a cluster of suits who needed charming. Ella exhaled. Clayton took the exhale as permission to be less clever. I didn't ask him to send the message, he said. I know, she said. I didn't want you to read it. I know, she said again, which was merciful and cruel at once. They found a quieter corner where the comet's turning made a slow river of the Milky Way. Below them, a tray drifted elegantly past a couple's knees before a server snagged it with practiced grace and a magnetized cloth. Hypothetically, Ella said, eyes on the stars, if I weren't here, if I were just some other systems tech, what would you tell her to do? Take the better offer. Go where the latitude is. Hypothetically, Clayton said, would tell her that latitude is a word men use when they've already drawn the borders. And that money is too heavy to carry if you can't put it down somewhere that loves you. He paused. And I'd tell her what I should have told her before any of this, that she is not just a line item on a staffing sheet. She is the room the rest of us breathe in. Ella's mouth tilted, faintly. Hypothetically, that's a nice speech. It's not a speech, he said. It's what's true when the lights are off. The comet's window washed them both in star milk. Somewhere behind them, Tad laughed in a way that said an agreement had just landed. Sarah's answering note was lower, more private. Clayton didn't turn. The syndicate's coming in 72 hours, Ella said after a while. They'll dine here first. They'll expect a household when they come to us. I can set a table like I set a brace. I can make a room that says, we intend to be here tomorrow. But I can't be the whole house. You already are, he didn't say. Instead, then we build it. Not because they asked. Because they're finally about to see what this place really is. Clay, she said, and the name in her mouth made something unclench in his chest. The place is you. No, he said. It's us. Tad reappeared with a tray and 2 glasses that had never had time to be anything but full. To us, he said, as if the word had been his all along. To the frontier. To the people who make it more than scrap and romance. They drank because refusing would have been a scene, and Clayton had already decided not to let Tad have those for free. The rest of the evening proceeded the way good evenings do when something crucial underneath them is slipping. Jokes landed. Deals wove their nets. Otis told a story that made a syndicate man laugh so hard he forgot to check his wallet. Vernon pinged the comm twice with small updates and the last with all quiet, sir, as if the night itself had heard they were trying to pass it without incident and decided to be kind. On the way back through the lock, Sarah fell into step with Clayton. If you want the syndicate to feel what I felt on your skiff, she said, let Ella host part of the tour. Don't parade her. Hand her the console and stand to the side. I've been standing to the side for 4 years, Clayton said, a touch too raw. Sarah considered him. Standing where she can see you is different from standing where the room can, she said. Up to you whether you want to be seen as a man who knows who keeps his world alive. They came home tired and overpolite, the way people are when their mouths get ahead of their hearts. The fortress accepted them with a satisfied hum, the Welds and Pasture 3's brace still warm enough to feel through the deck if you knew which shadow to stand in. Clayton had almost convinced himself the night would end on that soft note when the first alarm licked the air. Not a scream. Not yet. A tasteful chime no one would notice at a party. On Frontier 9, it landed like a dropped glass. Ella was moving before the second chime. Origin. Pasture 3, Otis said, already on the line. Your brace is good. The weather's not. Auroral index just jumped 2 bands for no cosmic reason I like. Ion shear? Clayton asked. More like ion greed, Otis said. It's eating where it can. The tether's holding, but the patch wants company. Vernon's voice overlaid his, urgent now. Miss Torren? I've got 3 head at the seam. They're pushing. The field's thin and they know it. Clayton didn't remember crossing the deck. One heartbeat he was at the hatch. The next he was in the skiff cradle, harness biting, the nebula's blue hand already closing into a fist beyond the glass. Beside him, Ella dropped into her chair and pulled the console around like a cloak. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Teach it a new song, Clayton said, and felt the skiff let go into the night. Chapter 4, The Storm Learns Our Names. The skiff fell into the seam like a bead into a groove, and the nebula threw lightning the color of old bruises. Pasture 3's hoop vibrated at the edge of audibility, a rimshot struck over and over by an impatient drummer. 3 lightstock had nosed into the thinnest part of the field, their bodies flickering with greedy delight as ion wind licked their flanks. Lure pattern, Clayton said. Live, Ella replied, and the skiff's belly painted the dark with a ladder of pulses. The herd turned, grudging as any creature being told to leave a favorite patch. Talk to me, C6, she added into the calm. Braced and cussing, Otis said. She'll hold, but she doesn't like being in a poem she didn't write. Copy. Ella's hands were a choreography all their own. Vernon, you're my shepherd tail. If any single head tests the seam, you nudge. You do not spook. I do not spook, the kid repeated, more for himself than for her. The field bucked. Clayton rode it, jaw tight. The skiff was nervous in his hands, all eager thrust and twitch. He throttled the instinct down toward steadiness. It's not a race, he told the ship, and maybe himself. Outside, the storm arrived not as rain, there was no rain out here, but as a kind of brightness that behaved like weather. It came in sheets that powdered the glass with static and made the hair on the back of Clayton's neck try to stand in a place where hair had no business standing. This shear isn't random, Ella said. It's found the tether's harmonics and it's surfing them. Can you knock it off the board? Not from here. She bit her lip, listening to what only she seemed able to hear. I can buy us minutes. Otis, kill B-rail for 3 seconds on my mark. 3, 2, now. Otis threw the switch. The pasture song hiccuped, and the shear, deprived of its favorite chord, overshot, skidding wide like a skater who'd lost the line. Ella shoved a countermelody into the back channel. The thin seam thickened to almost safety. Minutes, she said again. Not hours. She looked at Clayton, not asking but telling. I need to touch it. Eva. His stomach clenched. In this? I've danced in worse storms with uglier dates, she said. The brace is good, but the crowfoot's face is pitted. I can lay a quick skin over the scar to give the field something kinder to hold. I'll go, Clayton said, already checking the skiff's suit rack. You'll steer, Ella countered. We do not both go outside unless the fortress itself is confessing its sins. Besides, this is hand work. He wanted to argue. He wanted to lock the skiff down and carry her across the void like a thing too precious to risk. Instead, he helped her seal the suit, a small obedience that felt like sacrilege and respect at once. Helmet, he said, voice gone low. He clicked it home, his fingers knowing the dance from 100 drills and not a single one that had mattered like this. Do not let Vernon try to impress us, she murmured. Vernon, Clayton said into the calm, if you improvise, I will assign you to inventory gasket sizes for a month. I hate gaskets, Vernon said. Copy. The skiff kissed the crowfoot, magnets biting. Ella hooked her tether and slid into the glittering dark. The storm made a lace of light across her suit's field, tiny sparks crawling like fireflies with bad intentions. She reached the anchor face and laid the quick skin, an adhesive mesh that shimmered like a second thought, over the worst of the pits. The field steadied, appreciative. 2 minutes, she said. Maybe 3. Make it 4, Clayton said, because he'd never learned to pray any other way. The lightstock pushed as a group, the way creatures do when one of them finds a door. Vernon, God bless him, didn't improvise. He dropped his lure exactly where Ella would have put it, intersecting desire with duty. The push softened. Then the storm changed its mind. It came down the hoop like a hand slapping a table, and the skiff lurched so hard Clayton tasted copper. Alarms flirted with panic. The tether to Ella's suit went taut, then sang, then stuttered. Talk to me, he said, calm. He had to build one plank at a time. Hello, Ella replied, breath quick but even. Still here. Still busy. She finished the quick skin with a slap no engineer's manual would approve, then kicked off the anchor with the kind of grace that happens when a body knows the math before the math knows itself. The tether paid out clean and pulled her back toward the skiff in a long, precise arc. A bright lick of static found her on the way, a blue hand across the shoulder. Her body jerked, turned. Clayton swore in a language older than ships and flicked the skiff sideways, catching her with a reach that had no right to work and did anyway. Report, he said, helmet to helmet as he hauled her in. Warm, she said, with a shaky laugh. But not cooked. He sealed the lock and pulled her helmet off in one furious, grateful motion. Her hair, ripped from its tie, clung in damp strands to her temple where the suit had sweated her hard. The static had left a pink kiss along her jaw. Don't do that again, he said, aware of the hypocrisy. Every day, all day, he asked her to do that again. I'll do that any time the crowfoot asks, she said, and then, maybe because the storm and the adrenaline and the way the universe had tried to make a drum out of the things they loved, she added, very softly, I'm shaking, and it's not the storm. The skiff's lights made pale coins in her eyes. The fortress hummed in his bones. He realized, with the clarity of a blade laid on a whetstone, that he had run out of room for cleverness. Ella, he said. The word was an admission he had been hoarding for 4 years. Outside, the herd settled. The hoop's hum slipped from worry to work. Otis, in the manner of old men who know when to keep the line open and say nothing, said nothing. She reached, fingers still shaking, and brushed the scorch of static on his sleeve. We can't keep pretending we're just the hands holding the wrench, she whispered. I can't. Not after this. He would have kissed her then, storm outside, quiet inside, 1,000 days of almosts finally coalescing into one now, but the fortress is a jealous friend. The calm pinged with the officious politeness of money. Syndicate delegation itinerary updated. Day 1, Crowley Comet Facility, Hospitality Review. Day 2 morning, Frontier 9 Systems Audit. Day 2 evening, Household Supper, if any. A second ping stacked under it, Private Channel, Silkier. Ms. Torren, remarkable work under pressure. Your steadiness is exactly the kind of latitude we reward. Tomorrow, dinner, tighter circle. T. Crowley. Ella closed her eyes. The storm's afterlight made a faint aurora against the lids. When she opened them, resolve had cooled the glow. Brace held, she said, as if reporting to the room where the room could hear. Pasture's good. We can go home. They did, riding the lull between tantrums. In the equipment bay, Otis clapped Clayton on the shoulder with a look that said everything he chose not to say aloud. Vernon managed not to burst with the story of how he had not improvised. On the way to the lift, Clayton and Ella fell into step the way they always did when there was still work to do and no simple way to name what had just happened. At the threshold, he stopped. Dinner, he said, hating the taste of the word when it meant someone else's table. "Tomorrow," she said. "And not ours." The lift doors closed them into a small, humming box. For 6 floors, neither spoke. At 7, Ella said, "We fix what we can fix. Then we talk." Clayton nodded, and the lift sighed them toward the part that would be harder than any storm, telling the truth with the lights on. Chapter 5, Quiet Repairs, Loud Offers. The storm left the nebula scoured and beautiful, a room tidied by someone who knows where everything belongs. Frontier 9 wore the look of a place that had survived itself, gauges back in their lanes, welds cooling, the taste of ozone receding from the air vents. For 3 days, the fortress moved like a well-practiced hymn. Clay checked pastures in a sequence his body could run without his mind. Otis tuned a pump by leaning on it and telling it an unrepeatable joke. Vernon learned to fetch the right wrench the first time. Ella stitched the small tears storms always make, code comments updated, supply lists pulled into order, 2 new quick skins cut and labeled with the neat handwriting she used for things she intended to last. The syndicate's itinerary ticked closer. Their first night, as promised, belonged to Tad's Comet. Their second day dawned with a visit to Frontier 9 and a supper invitation that wasn't yet an invitation at all. Clayton stood in the galley watching Ella slide loaves into a convection drawer whose door never stayed true unless you glared at it. She glared. It submitted. Somewhere past courtesy, they had taken turns sleeping and avoiding all the sentences that might cost more than they could afford. The mail light blinked. "Yours," Ella said, not looking up. He checked. Contract drafts. A shipment confirmation. A personal note from Mrs. Drummond with a recipe for something called legacy stew, and a postscript that read, "Men with tables get contracts, dear." Another light blinked. Ella's this time. The sender field was brutally honest. Tad Crowley. She didn't open it right away. She pulled the loaves instead, 2 golden, 1 ambitious. Then she wiped her hands on a towel she'd hemmed herself, took a breath, and tapped. Ms. Torren. Offer enclosed. Compensation, double current base. Housing, private module, full view. Authority, systems chief with budget discretion. Additional consideration, equity ladder, hospitality stipend, companionship as negotiated. Dinner tonight to discuss. Carriage at 19. Tea. The last line sat in the air between them like a chair no one wanted to claim. Clayton felt his mouth go dry. The fury that rose in him wasn't theatrical. It was a tight, ugly coil built of fear and ownership and the shame of both. He set the tablet down because if he didn't, he would break it and then they would have one more thing to fix with time they didn't have. Companionship, he said, carefully. Negotiated, Ella said, flat. He wrote what you'd think he'd only imply. He knows you're not for sale, Clayton said. He knows I'm on a payroll, she said. He's offering to move the decimal and the walls around it. Ella. Don't, she said, sharply enough to cut his name in two. Then, softer, don't talk to me like a problem you can torque into place. I have lived 4 years in a house that could vanish under my feet if a more acceptable woman decided my chair looked like hers. That's not. You never promised it wasn't, she said. No heat, worse. Accuracy. You've been fair. You've been good. You have not told me what happens to me if you marry someone else for the sake of a story an investor will eat with a spoon. He stood there, a man in a kitchen that had been warmed by all the things he could not call his. I didn't think I was allowed. You are allowed the truth, she said. So am I. They looked at each other across the short distance people build when the next words decide the decade. The fortress listened. Otis did not come in. Vernon, instructed by a sense older than training, found somewhere else to be. Clayton took the breath he used before stepping into vacuum. I want you here, he said. Not as an employee I'm grateful for until a better narrative arrives. As a partner. As the person I tell first when the pasture hums wrong and when the morning is beautiful for no reason. I want your name on the decisions. On the ledger. On the door. You want, she echoed, not unkind, but not forgiving the slippage. I love you, he said, because it was time to spend the hardest word. I should have said it before a storm and a rival and a line item forced it out of me. I should have been braver sooner. Something in her face cracked, not in weakness, in relief. I have been so angry at you, she said, and now the heat did come, honest and clean. Not because you didn't see me, I can forgive blindness. Because you refused to look. Because you let me carry the weight of pretending that this was enough, when you knew it wasn't, not for either of us. I was afraid, he said. If we broke this, I wouldn't know where to sleep. We would have fixed it, she said. It's what we do. They stood very close without touching. The galley smelled like bread and ozone. The nebula, visible through the small porthole at the end of the hall, did something extravagant with blue. I'm not giving you an answer right now, she said. I won't give him one either, not tonight. I will go to the dinner because I need to hear my own voice in a room where it would be easier to let someone else talk for me. I hate that, he said, and then, because the truth owed no one politeness, go. She nodded. When I know, you'll be the first who does. At 19, the carriage arrived, a Crowley shuttle that wore luxury like a cologne. Otis, who had put on his good jacket with the permanent oil stain because respect is respect, pretended not to scowl. Vernon, who had smoothed his hair 3 times with a palm, offered to escort Ella to the dock and then remembered she didn't need escorting anywhere. Clayton waited at the inner hatch. Ella joined him, jacket neat, boots clean, the grease constellation gone from her cheek. She looked like herself. It hurt how grateful he was for that. Household supper, she said, a wry tilt to her mouth. When they come. I can set a table that tells the story they should believe. You won't, he said. Not ever again. She held his gaze until the shuttle pinged an impatient note. Then she touched 2 fingers to the scorch on his sleeve as if blessing a place the storm had kissed. Wish me nerve, she said. You have mine, he said, and the hatch took her. He watched the shuttle spin out into the velvet, a bright insect going to a flower he didn't trust. The fortress hummed. The bread timer dinged, absurd and kind. He took the loaves out himself and burned one because some things you cannot do as well as the person who taught a machine what warm means. He ate a heel with his hands and paced the gallery until the nebula started announcing dawn in colors he didn't feel he'd earned yet. Chapter 6, What We Owe Tomorrow. He tried not to rehearse. Rehearsal is a superstition men practice when they know the speech will fall apart at the first look. He walked the corridors instead, listening to the familiar diction of Frontier 9, the whir that made the hydroponics smug, the cluck of a valve he'd promised to replace last month, the satisfied sigh that told him Otis had found the pump's joke and made it laugh. At 21, the calm lit with a short notice that could have been a mercy or a cruelty, delay. Dinner extended. Return ETA, 2300 plus. He took the news like a nail under the thumbnail and kept moving. At 23, the shuttle returned. He made himself stay on the porch, if a star fortress can be said to have a porch, hands in pockets the way a man looks relaxed on the day he isn't. The hatch breathed. Ella stepped through and paused at the threshold as if measuring the exact size of home. Our table, she said, by way of greeting, voice hoarse from polite conversation. It will be better. How was his? Clayton asked, because some honesty required the shape of a question even when both knew the answer wouldn't fit in it. Plentiful, she said. Warm. Loud. He's good at making a room feel like it's already part of his story. She smiled without humor. He offered me latitude again. He put numbers on it this time that would make most people dizzy. Companionship? Clayton asked, and the word tasted like a door closing. Negotiated, she said, and then shook her head as if trying to dislodge the caveat. He was careful. He offered respect, too, and I believe him, in his way. He sees what I can do. He wants it near his name. And you? He didn't mean do you want him. He meant the larger, uglier thing, do you want to be seen from there? I want a place that wants me, she said simply. Not my usefulness. Me. The woman who hums back at a machine until it remembers the tune. The one who burns the second loaf because she's counting bolts while the timer goes soft. A tiny, almost embarrassed laugh. He said he could love that. I believe he could. In a way that works for him. She reached into her jacket and pulled something out he hadn't realized he'd lost. A small titanium patch, the old Frontier 9 crest he'd had attached to a jacket so worn it had given up the ghost. Somewhere between storm and stubbornness, the patch had separated. Ella had found it, cleaned it, burnished the edges smooth where the fabric had frayed. You left this in the shop, she said. It belongs where people can see it. He took it. The metal was warm from her pocket. It lay in his palm with the soft weight of something that had meant more than he'd remembered to say aloud. He didn't trust his throat, so he nodded, once. She stepped closer, not to kiss, not yet, to set her back against the rail and look past him as if the nebulous river might speak up with an answer. I asked him, she said, what happens when the story changes. When investors want a new costume. When my face gets old. He said he'd make room. I believe he thinks that's true. And me? Clayton asked, and the question was naked and clumsy and finally brave. What happens here when our story changes? You tell the truth sooner, she said, and the softness in it almost undid him. And you build rooms I can move into without asking who used to sleep there. He made the decision he should have made before any rival offered him a mirror. He held the patch between thumb and forefinger like a vow and said, Ella Torren, will you marry me? Will you put your name on this house, on the ledgers, on the door, on whatever children might someday track dust down these corridors and learn the hum by heart? Will you be the cosigner of every stupid risk I think I have to take and the person who tells me when I'm worshipping my pride instead of our life? Her eyes filled the way tanks do when you've built the grade right. You know I need to think, she said, not as a refusal, as a respect offered to the very thing he'd asked for. Not because I don't know how this feels. Because I need to know I'm not saying yes to win a race you think you're in with a man who owns a comet. She smiled, and it was the first unguarded thing she'd given him all night. I need to choose us. Not him. Take the time, he said, and meant it, because love without latitude is a contract by another name. Tomorrow, she said. Before the audit. I'll tell you before I set the table. They didn't touch. Some tendernesses are too exact for hands. She left him at the rail with the patch in his palm and the aurora playing its slow, silent music. He went to the small office that had been pretending to be a captain's room and laid the patch on the desk like a paperweight for gravity. He wrote a new ledger header, Frontier 9 Holdings, Rudd and Torren. He stared at the ampersand until it turned from a doodle into a promise. Morning came wearing syndicate gray. Tad's facility pinged a cheerful see you soon that Clayton deleted without reading. Sarah sent a note that said only, let her lead. Then stand where everyone can see you letting her. He was still deciding exactly which chores could briefly live without him when Otis's voice came over the line, spare of ornament. Boss, you want to see this? See what? A carriage, Otis said, and though the word was antique out here, it fit. Comet Man sent his prettiest shuttle and it's painted with a bow where a bow has no business being. Clayton's mouth went dry. He's early, he said. He's hungry, Otis said, which was the shorter way to say the same thing. Clayton stepped into the corridor. At the far end, Ella appeared, chin high, jacket neat, the set to her mouth a woman's yes to her own dignity. She saw the shuttle through the port, saw the bow, and laughed, a single, surprised silver note that made the fortress lift its head. This is ridiculous, she said. It's a sales pitch, he said. It's a test, she corrected, and turned back to him with eyes that had been awake all night. Come to the dock, she said. If he thinks I'm getting into that like a prize, he hasn't listened very closely. They walked together. At the lock, the shuttle's pilot performed a bow to match the paint. Ms. Torren, he said. Mr. Crowley asked me to. Tell Mr. Crowley, Ella said, that if he wants to talk to me before the audit, he can do it in my house or he can do it tomorrow like a professional. Tonight, I am busy making a table. The pilot faltered. Ma'am, he. She reached past him, keyed the hatch, and shut the shuttle out with the clean finality of a door that has learned its job. Then she turned to Clayton, and whatever answer she'd been shaping moved to the surface of her face with a clarity that made his knees want to sit down. Set the good plates, she said. And find the knife Otis sharpened and then pretended not to. We have a story to serve. Clayton stared, stupid with relief. Ella. Tomorrow morning, she said, stepping close enough that he could smell the soap she'd used like armor. Before the audit. I'll say the word you asked for. What word? The one that puts my name on the door. She smiled, fierce, bright, unafraid. Practice putting it there without flinching. He watched her go toward the galley with a stride that made the fortress change how it stood. He looked out the port at the shuttle with its painted bow, at the comet path beyond, at the nebula rehearsing dawn for the investors who would believe what they were fed. He touched the patch in his pocket. He did not flinch. Chapter 7, The Decision of the Widow. Morning arrived the way good truths do, plain, impossible to ignore, washing the fortress in a gray that made liars of fancy lights. Clayton stood at the galley counter, the titanium patch in his hand like a coin you could spend only once. The bread he'd burned last night had been sliced to salvage, the heel sat beside the cutting board like a small admission. Ella came in without ceremony, hair braided, jacket open, sleeves already pushed to the elbow as if the day had asked her what she was good for and she'd answered. She poured water into the kettle, set it on the stubborn drawer that never quite closed straight, and pressed the latch until it obeyed. Then she turned, leaned against the counter, and looked at the man who had built walls strong enough to keep vacuum out and fear in. You still want what you said? She asked. Not because it fixes a story. Because it's the story. Clayton placed the patch on the table between them and slid it forward until it touched her knuckles. I want the ledger to read Rudd and Torren because that's what this place already is when the lights are off, he said. I want your name on the door. The decisions. The risk. The kids, if the universe is kind enough. I want to stop acting like you are gravity I am borrowing. She absorbed it like heat. Then hear me clearly, she said. I love you. I've loved you in the space between screws and storm warnings and coffee at 4 a.m. because the pumps woke me up first. I'm not marrying you to save a contract. I'm marrying you because this is home when we speak the truth out loud. Some words land with thunder. Others with the soft authority of a tool set back exactly where it belongs. Yes, she said, and the fortress seemed to lift an inch as if its bolts had been loosened just enough to let joy fit. She reached into a drawer and came up with a tube of adhesive and a small steel awl. Let's make it visible, she said. On the corridor outside the galley, where the traffic of 100 days had polished the rail to a shy shine, there was a frame where the original frontier crest had lived before time and storms and negligence had stolen it. Ella cleaned it, laid the patch, pressed. For a second nothing held. Then the adhesive caught, a bond that would not give without fire. Clayton set his palm against the metal beside hers. Rudd and Torren, he said, testing the shape. He didn't flinch. The com chimed, and the voice that came through had practiced cheer. Syndicate delegation on approach, the pilot said. Ms. Reyes presiding, Mr. Klein at operations. Observers attached. Observers? Clayton echoed. Helena Interstellar, the pilot replied. And Crowley Holdings. Of course, Ella murmured. They had an hour to get ready and 20 years' worth of readiness already in place. Otis put on the jacket with the permanent oil stain and a tie that didn't match because vanity is an extravagance a man earns by outliving mistakes. Vernon scrubbed his hands until they were the color of ambition and asked any tool he touched to be on its best behavior. "Let me lead," Ella said in the lift, voice soft because softness does not equal doubt. "Then stand where they can see you letting me." "Yes, ma'am," Clayton said, and watched something relieved and mischievous pass through her eyes at the way he'd phrased it. Docking ring 3 coughed politely. The air curtain sighed, then the syndicate walked in, Ms. Reyes with a tablet and an expression like a ruler, Mr. Klein with a sensibility that measured intolerances, 2 aides who had not yet learned to hide their boredom, and Sarah in observer gray, her smile both welcome and warning. Tad came last, hat in hand because hats meant theater and theater meant control. "Commander Rudd," Ms. Reyes said. "Systems, Ms. Torren." She pronounced the title as if testing whether the air would allow it. "Systems and co-owner," Ella said, not a hair of triumph in it. If pride had been a substance, hers was the kind that filled gaps without swelling. Ms. Reyes's eyebrows flickered. She made a small note on the tablet. "We begin with the tour," she said. "Unexpected events will be simulated. Hospitality review at 1900. If there is hospitality." "There is," Ella said. "You'll leave full and certain." They walked. Ella narrated not like a docent laying out a museum but like a musician introducing you to an instrument she'd taught to sing. She pointed at the magneto pastures, and instead of speaking in units of output, she talked about how long a tether could hum before the note told you it wanted fresh bearings. She showed them the brace at pasture 3 and, without apology, the quick skin where storms had taken a bite. She let Vernon explain his job in his own excited words and never once corrected him in public. She asked Otis if he had anything to add and waited while he bent over the anchor face, pressed his palm to the steel, and said, "She's not proud. She'll tell you when she's aching if you're the kind of person who listens to your elders." Ms. Reyes gave nothing away. Mr. Klein betrayed himself twice, once when he leaned in despite himself at the sound of the pasture's hum through Ella's filter, and again when he made a note hard enough to strain the stylus as Otis spoke. Sarah's attention moved with relief. This was the thing she had wanted them to see. Tad played the gentleman rival, pointing out with pleased astonishment improvements he had been meaning to try, remembering to give credit even when it cost him nothing. However the evening ended, he would not let it be said that he'd failed the room. At the control core, Ms. Reyes said, "We will black out a subsystem. Your choice." She looked at Ella. "Don't choose the easy one," Mr. Klein added. He meant, "Don't game us." "Hydro circulation, loop 2, Ella answered, instantly. Clayton's head snapped. "Ella. If loop 2 fails at dinner, we lose comfortable," she said. "Lose comfortable, we lose confident. Lose confident, we lose the deal." Ms. Reyes's mouth smiled without the rest of her face. "Proceed." Ella killed loop 2 herself. The fortress made the smallest possible complaint while the system bled pressure like a regret. The air thinned by a fraction no one should have felt and everyone did. "Talk me through your fix," Ms. Reyes said. "First we stop the panic," Ella replied. "Panic makes bad patches." She touched 3 panels in a rhythm that would have looked like grace even to an untrained eye: divert, isolate, warn. Then we build a bridge. She sent loop 1 to pick up load without busting, toggled auxiliary pump 3, yes, the one that sulked on wet days, and had Vernon run a manual check to prevent a ghost reading from becoming a rumor. Then we restore dignity, she finished, rebuilding pressure like a seamstress who does not tug a thread until she knows where it ends. Loop 2 came back up with a sigh audibly grateful. Mr. Klein cleared his throat, the sound of a man revising a memo in his head. Ms. Reyes made 2 more notes, then closed the tablet. "Dinner at 1900, she said. "We will be curious." "Good," Ella said. "Curious is the appetite a table deserves." They left to change and whisper and pretend their conclusions were not already half-written. That gave Frontier 9 4 hours to shape the meal that would decide a decade. Hospitality is a weapon when it is used like a mirror. Ella set a table that made the fortress visible to the kind of people who normally saw only numbers, stainless plates polished not to luxury but to clarity, bread Otis had kneaded with hands that had tightened bolts for 30 years, stew built from protein vats and stubborn roots, and a spice Mrs. Drummond swore optimized trust. At each place sat a simple card, one line of work no one ever saw and the name of the person who did it. Vernon, frost purge valves, 0300. Otis, pump 3 jokes. Ella, loop 2 lullaby. Clayton, pastures at dawn. Names first, Ella said. Then food. They ate. The stew did its ancient job. Ms. Reyes asked 3 questions that mattered disguised as small talk. Mr. Klein told a story about a ship his father had loved that failed for lack of a bolt no one felt responsible for. Sarah relaxed into the room as if a muscle she carried between worlds had finally been allowed to stop flexing. Tad told one of his comet stories and even Clayton laughed, because a good rival learns that much when he hits the mark. Halfway through the meal, the lights dipped, not an accident, a planned breath. Ella let silence sit, 2 heartbeats. Prevention isn't sexy, she said, repeating the line that had made the comet hull lean toward her, but it's why your children sleep. The room exhaled. Someone clinked a spoon. Someone else, one of the aides, smiled without permission. When they rose from the table, Ms. Reyes set her tablet down and didn't pick it up again. We have what we need, she said, which is investor, for we felt what we came to measure. They walked to the gallery for one last look. The Aurora performed as if booked. Ms. Reyes stepped aside to take a call, Mr. Klein pretended not to eavesdrop, Sarah rested her hands on the rail, Tad drifted to Ella with a gentleness that would have fooled anyone who hadn't already met him twice. Whatever they decide, he said quietly, what you've built here is the kind of thing that makes men like me behave better just to qualify to stand near it. Ella's mouth softened. Then stand near it, she said. Don't try to own it. He tipped his hat, no theater in it. Fair. The comm chimed once, official and final. Ms. Reyes returned to the room with the expression of someone who had just been handed the right card at the right time. Recommendation filed, she said. Final award announcement at 0900. Clayton felt the world tilt the slightest degree and then right itself. Understood, he said. It wasn't a yes. It was a cliff. The delegation left with courtesy intact and appetites converted. Ella turned toward the galley to clean up the last light dishes always tell at the end of a brave meal. Clayton caught her hand, just long enough to steal one plain, grateful kiss that promised the morning what the evening had earned. Tomorrow, she whispered against his mouth. Tomorrow, he agreed. The fortress settled. The aurora dimmed. The clock walked itself toward the hour that would turn the work of 4 years into a single sentence. Chapter 8, Hearts That Build Tomorrow. At 8:59, Frontier 9 sounded like a place holding its breath and refusing to admit it. At 9 o'clock, the comm piece belled once. Clayton tapped receive and made his own face neutral so that the room could choose what to do with the news. The syndicate crest unfolded. Ms. Reyes's voice followed, clipped, ceremonial. Frontier 9, she said, award granted. Vernon hooped like a boy who had been good and just found out the universe had noticed. Otis said, well I'll be, and didn't finish because men who've lived on the edge don't use up all their words at once. Clayton closed his eyes, only long enough to put the sentence somewhere it could build muscle. Ella's hand found his, palm to palm, the contact practical and holy. Ms. Reyes continued. Contract term, 7 cycles with resilience bonus. Clause 12 recognizes household leadership as an operational control. Our audit notes the following: steadiness is observable, prevention is a cultural artifact, household is not decor but data. We expect the same tomorrow as today. You will get better, Ella said, into the room and the calm and the future. See that we do, Ms. Reyes said, and ended the call like a person who disliked goodbyes. Tad pinged 3 minutes later with a message that managed to be generous and strategic. Well played. Drinks when the jealousy fades, work tomorrow. Routes to coordinate. He attached a draft of a corridor-sharing agreement so reasonable that refusing would look like spite. Clayton smiled despite himself. We'll compete and collaborate, he said aloud, the pact honest enough for this edge of space. Sarah sent a tight, personal note. Proud of you both. Recommendation line was mine. Don't waste it. She added a PS, put the patch photo in your next investor update. It says more than any spreadsheet. Clayton took Ella to the observation gallery because some news belongs in front of glass. The aurora had chosen a green that made memory and hope shake hands. He turned to her. Marry me today, he said. Not because the ink's wet. Because the ink just caught up. I brought my good boots, she said, which is yes if you've ever had to cross a deck that might shear. They did not build pomp. They built a circle. Otis dug a ring from a drawer where he kept things that had lasted past their first usefulness. It had been a coupling once, cleaned, polished, the edges softened on a wheel he loved. Vernon found a ribbon from a crate that had come full and left empty and tied it around the coupling with a skill that made Ella raise an eyebrow in question he flushed to answer. My aunt taught me knots. The pretty ones. They stood under the gallery dome with the rail for an altar and the fortress for a choir. Mrs. Drummond appeared on a screen, having bullied convenience into becoming tradition. She insisted on reading something about legacy that made even Tad's distant grin sharpen into actual respect. Sarah sent a toast in a small bottle that Otis declared would be smashed against the hull at an appropriate and safe angle. Speak the part that matters, Otis said, officiant by right of decades. Say what you intend to do when it's boring and when it's burning. Clayton looked at Ella and spoke as if he were writing a checklist he meant to live by. I intend to tell you the truth before the storm forces it out. I intend to put your name on the door and the ledger and the map. I intend to listen when the house hums wrong and when you do. I intend to pick up the wrench when it's my turn and the spoon when it's yours, and I intend to be wrong in ways that make us better, not bitter. Ella smiled like a woman who had hoped to hear exactly that and still felt surprised by the shape of it. I intend, she said, to keep this place gentle on purpose. To make quiet that children can grow in. To throw alarms early and spare us drama late. To love you in the way that fixes small things before they become big and forgives big things because we are not small. To choose us when it would be easier to choose the story someone else is selling. Rings, Otis said, and Vernon, solemn for once, presented the polished coupling. They each touched it, then each other's hands, and a covenant older than starlight folded itself over work that would begin again tomorrow. They kissed, not like people trying to win a room, not like people despairing of making another chance, but like two who understood the shift in a machine when you align a bearing properly, less noise, less heat, more life. After, the fortress needed attending because love doesn't stop pumps from sulking. They made their rounds as a pair who had decided to remain a pair even on days when the word for it felt too heavy. In pasture 3 the brace held, though it creaked in a way that made Ella make a note on a square of tape and stick it to a panel. Listen here next week. In hydro, Loop 2 cooperated as if proud of having been the star of yesterday's test. In the galley, the stubborn drawer stayed shut on the first try, terrified into obedience by the sanctity of newlywed kitchens. By evening, neighbors arrived from stations with names like songs. Someone brought a fiddle and the courage to play it, someone else brought a batch of stew that tasted exactly like friendship. Tad came last, as if theatrics demanded he let the room assemble without him. He stepped through the air curtain, saw the ring on Ella's hand, and did the only decent thing a rival can do when the game is over. He took off his hat without flourish and said, "Treat each other right or I'll revoke the congratulations." "We will," Ella said, and for the first time he believed he wasn't necessary to the line. He took Clayton aside with a father's frankness he didn't own. "You built a table," he said. "Keep setting it. I'll still try to beat you on price every third Thursday." "Try," Clayton said, and they shook on an armistice made of math and manners. Night deepened. The aurora draped itself over the dome like a blessing. Mrs. Drummond cried again on screen. Sarah said something that sounded like a benediction and then mocked herself for it. Otis told a joke that made the pump laugh. Vernon danced with whoever would let him, badly, earnestly, perfectly. Later, when the small celebration had drifted into comfortable pockets and the children of the neighboring crews had fallen asleep under tables that had not been designed for such good work, Clayton and Ella slipped to the gallery again. He leaned his forearms on the rail and watched the herd drift in their pasture, content and bright. She pressed her shoulder to his and listened the way she always had, as if the house might tell her a secret just for being patient. "We're really doing this," he said, the kind of wonder a man allows himself to feel when astonishment has earned tenure. "We've been doing it," she corrected, amused and tender. "We just put the nameplate on." "Rudd and Torren," he said. She nodded. "Frontier 9, where prevention is sexy after all." He laughed out loud, the sound of a man who looked for something across the galaxy and found it where he kept his coffee. "Tomorrow," he said, because men like him need to remind themselves the universe always brings another list. "Tomorrow," she agreed. "We intend to be here." Out beyond the glass, the herd flared once, as if a ripple of joy had passed through creatures that understood very little about contracts but everything about steadiness. The fortress hummed, home, not hardware. And somewhere between the aurora and the welded brace, in the heart of two people who had finally said the hard words easy, the frontier shifted from a place you survived to a place you built. Traveler, if you felt that pulse, the one that says humanity doesn't just cross the dark, we furnish it, stay with us. There are more edges to light, more storms to teach new songs, and more households to build at the end of the map. Subscribe to Sci-Fi Nebula and keep your hands on the rail, the next story is already humming.